Can clients fire you for supporting Black Lives Matter? Today on the podcast.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
Hey out there, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Rob. I will be your host for this episode. Today, we are going to be talking about the exceptionally strange case of a client firing a wedding photographer out in Ohio because that wedding photographer posted their support of Black Lives Matter. We're going to be getting into the legal implications of that, delving a little bit into that particular case and how it might apply to you and what you might be able to do in a similar situation. All of those things coming up. But first, a call to action. Please, if you could, go to my YouTube channel, which is Wedding Industry Law, like and subscribe to that channel because I am trying to grow my subscriber base there. My ultimate goal is to get to 1,000 subscribers. I know that's not a lot when compared to all the influencers out there, PewDiePie or whoever these people are. 1,000 gets me the ability to do live streaming from my phone, which is ultimately my goal. I want to be able to do this type of thing on the go from YouTube. So I'd really appreciate it if you can go out there. If you've got any suggestions for content for the podcast, please let me know. I try to get to every comment in substance on this podcast. So please do that. I'll be your best friend. Now, on with the episode. So somewhere in June of this year, a wedding photographer named Shakira Rochelle out of Ohio. She runs Shakira Rochelle Photography. She, obviously like many of us, myself included, felt compelled to show support for the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's about on social media. Elsewhere, maybe on their website, I know that I went to different marches, contributed to different causes, but something that many people were doing in that time and still doing today, supporting Black Lives Matter. What she did was to post a Instagram post that literally just said Black Lives Matter. That was the actual content of the graphic. Underneath, she says, Shakira Rochelle Photography stands in solidarity with the Black community. The Black Lives Matter movement has my endless support. So pretty common, not anything crazy out of the ordinary. Sometime later, she gets a text from a client that she had already signed up but not yet done a wedding for. The text from the client goes as follows. I'm sorry to say that we are requesting a refund on the deposit for our wedding. We have done a lot of talking and we cannot bring ourselves to support anyone who is so outspoken on matters that simply do not concern them, as well as someone that does not believe that all lives matter. We would be truly embarrassed to have you at our event and feel that you aren't stable enough to complete the job we need from you. Please let me know when and how we can expect our refund, and we are requesting to be relieved from our contract. Okay, so every time I read that, my blood boils, but let's get to the next part. So Shakira responds via text, I am sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, the contract you signed states that your deposit is non-refundable. I will email you a cancellation agreement shortly that will require your signature to forfeit your date. I wish you a lifetime of growth, and I would like to thank you for your donation to Black Lives Matter. And then the following text back from the client is you'll be hearing from my lawyer. And all this is reported online. I'll post the link in the show description. I'm not just making this up. This is what's been reported. So, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the deposit the client wants back is somewhere around the $150 range. So not one of the most crazy expensive deposits put down, but at any rate, the client wants the deposit back. So it's pretty clear that the client is canceling this contract with the photographer exclusively for the photographer's support of Black Lives Matter. It looks like there could be some context here about you're outspoken on matters that don't concern you. It's possible that the client might be referring to something else that's happened between the photographer and the client. I doubt it, but maybe that's what it is. But it seems that if I was a judge looking at this, or if I was a jury looking at this, it's obviously the crux of the matter is, I'm firing you because you support Black Lives Matter. Okay. So what are the legal implications? Was Shakira right in not refunding the deposit? Was it okay that Shakira posted that in the Black Lives Matter Instagram post in the first place? So let me just start off by saying that essentially, well, let me start off with the ground rules here and where I'm going to go with this. My opinions on this are based on the fact that this is a client firing the service provider, not the other way around, because that would have important implications. So this is that we're only talking about this scenario, client firing service provider. We are only going to be talking about the fact that this is a service contract, not an employment contract. This isn't like somebody being fired from a factory because they, spoke badly about, top brass or had their own political idea, something like that. This is not an employment agreement. Employment agreements are kind of looked at a little bit differently, particularly where there's morality clauses. And finally, I myself, for the purposes of this episode, I'm not a political scientist. I'm just a regular dude, white male from middle-aged from Mountain Juliet, Tennessee. In the context of this episode, I am going to be talking about Black Lives Matter as a political and moral position that people of color are disproportionately killed or mistreated by law enforcement due to either historic systematic racism or an unconscious bias as a result of systematic racism. That's my perception of what Black Lives Matter is. I'm not an expert at this, but when I'm saying BLM in this particular instance, what Shakira was talking about, that's the concept, as opposed to a religious idea, an idea, something maybe esoteric. I don't know. Like, I'm trying to really refine what we're talking about because that would have implications in service contracts. So it's a political / moral position that somebody can have. Okay. So as a threshold matter, you cannot just get out of a service contract because you disagree with the political philosophy of the service provider. Okay. You can't just get out of that. There has to be some type of legal mechanism by which you can get out of a service contract. And typically when we're dealing with opinions of people, opinions of service providers, your legal mechanism of getting out of that contract is probably either going to be breach of contract or some type of fraud. Now, fraud is different from state to state. Obviously, breach of contract is different from state to state, but fraud we can either refer to as misrepresentation or some type of fraud in the inducement. That's going to, breach of contract or some type of fraud is going to be the only ways probably for someone to try to even think about getting out of a service contract due to the political philosophy or the moral position of the service provider. So with the first bucket, we've got breach of contract. Breach of contract, and I've got other episodes dealing with what breach of contract is from a legal standpoint, but essentially it boils down to this. Breach of contract is the failure to perform an obligation as promised. Contracts are exchanges of promises. Breach of contract is where you don't fulfill the obligation of one of those promises. Now, in any given contract, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of explicit promises. There are obvious promises, like the ones that are set in stone in the contract themselves, like showing up on January 26th at, I don't know, the old Union Mill train station to take pictures of a wedding. That's an explicit promise. Then you've got thousands of implicit promises. So, for example, I'll show up at the old Union Mill train station to take pictures of your wedding, and even though it's not in the contract, there's an implicit promise that I show up with pants on. I'm not going to be nude. Does that make sense? By the same token, the contract is explicit that you pay me $150 or $1,000 or $10,000, whatever the case may be, to take pictures. The implicit promise is that it's not going to be in $10,000 worth of chicken. It's going to be in American currency, not Bitcoin, not Brazilian reais. It's implicit that I will be paid American money. So there are explicit promises, implicit promises, all of which you could potentially breach. So unless this is the strangest contract ever made, there is not going to be an explicit provision that says I will refrain from supporting Black Lives Matter. So is a political position, is it possible that a political position could be an implicit promise that you give to somebody in a service contract? I would argue probably not. It's probably not. It wouldn't make any sense. And as I was trying to prepare for this episode, I try to do things in analogies to make it kind of easier in our head. And the best one that I could come up with was, let's say that your sink is leaking and you hire a plumber. Plumber comes to begin working on the sink. As the plumber finishes fixing your sink, you look out the window, notice a bumper sticker on the plumber's truck. That bumper sticker is a political party that you hate. Does that mean that you can send the plumber home, even though the plumber has already done this work, even if the plumber hasn't done the work? Is it okay for you to fire that plumber? Would that make any sense? Was the political party of that plumber in any way obligatory or necessary for the work to be performed? I would argue no. It's not an implicit promise necessary for the fulfillment of the contract. So let's take it to an extreme then. What if the bumper sticker, if you find out that that plumber has a bumper sticker of a political party or a political idea that a majority of the people in your community or even the country hate? Does it then rise to the level of an implicit promise necessary to fulfill those services? Again, I would say no. I have racked my brain in the past 2 or 3 weeks trying to find case law that would warrant the ability for somebody to fire that plumber because they notice that they are a member of a political party that is that it's extreme or that is not supported by a majority of people. And again, I'm not conflating Black Lives Matter with that scenario. I'm just trying to push it to extremes to make the point that no, that is not an implicit promise. So again, the idea of breach of contract is that you've breached something that was promised to you. And I guess at the end of the day, no reasonable person in any contract in any jurisdiction could foreseeably believe that they've been promised that that service provider is going to refrain from supporting Black Lives Matter. So let's take, and again, I'm separating this from employment contracts, particularly employment contracts that have morality provisions in them. So let's talk about fraud. What's the possibility that support of Black Lives Matter could support you being fired because it's fraud in the eyes of the client? Fraud in most jurisdictions is a cause of action that requires evidence of 6, 7, 8 different elements. You've got to have a representation of a fact. That representation has to be false. it has to be material to the bargain, meaning it's got to be one of the most important terms like price, location, scope of service. The person providing the representation must know that it's false, must intend that the other party sign on the dotted line because of that false representation, and there's got to be some type of damage. In other words, there has to be a material term that somebody says turns out to be false, and the only reason why that person signed on the dotted line was because of that false representation. And again, I can't find a case that's even close to being similar to this. The only way that I can think of would be if for some reason a wedding photographer maybe has like Fraternal Order of Police on their website, or like I love police or whatever. And then and as the client is signing the contract, like, I love the fact that you love police or blah, blah, blah. And then, and that's why I picked you out of 1,000 wedding photographers. And then all of a sudden you're posting about Black Lives Matter. It's possible that might be one, but that is such a stretch because, again, in order for there to be fraud, it has to be material. And only in the weirdest scenario is support of Black Lives Matter or not supporting Black Lives Matter going to be material to any bargain regarding wedding photography or wedding services at all. It has to be material to the bargain. So can this client that fired the wedding photographer in Ohio get out of the contract without any liability based on breach of contract or fraud? It's possible, but I don't care what's possible. I only care what's likely. And I don't think that it's very likely based on case law, based on the laws of most states. And even though I can't find a case that's on point to this, I would, if I was I am a betting man. I don't know why I say if I was a betting man. I am a betting man, and I would bet against this lady. So, or I'm assuming that it's a lady. I don't know if it's a lady or not. It could be a dude. I'm talking about the client. I'm betting against the client. I think that Shakira Rochelle, this wedding photographer, handled herself above board. I think that she did. She handled it way better than I probably would have handled it if I was in her situation. So at the end of the day, I would not be too worried about posting whatever you feel to Instagram, particularly if it's in support of Black Lives Matter. I think that's an exceptional cause. I think it's great. I would not worry in the least about getting fired from clients or having to worry about deposits. And again, this is going to have to depend on what the language of your contract is. But if your contract is even okay, then you're going to be in good standing to do what Shakira did in Ohio when that happened to her. So, short episode this week. I just wanted to put this out there. This is something that I wanted to do a hot take on, but time kept going by and I was like, well, I'll just make it a podcast episode. So I hope that this was a little bit enlightening for you and that you learn a little bit of something from it. If you have any ideas that you would like to see me talk about on future episodes, please be sure to hit me up. Again, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hit me up on Instagram. And with that, you can catch us next week. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.